Nathan Cole had said no 3 times. He was sitting alone at an outdoor table at a Mediterranean restaurant on West Calloway Street. Stone pavers, string lights, white tablecloths that cost more per dinner than he made in a day. His flannel shirt was the cleanest one he owned. His phone was face down on the table. He was holding a menu he hadn't read a single word of. He didn't want to be here. The sound of heels on stone. He looked up. The woman walking toward him in the ivory slip dress was not a stranger. Victoria Marsh, CEO, 14th floor. The woman he had spent 7 months carefully avoiding. He did not move. The question arrived in his chest before it reached his brain. Quiet and very cold. How exactly was he supposed to get out of this? He had not run. That needed to be said first. Not because he wasn't thinking about it the moment her heels hit the first stone paver in his line of sight. Some part of him was already calculating angles. Stand up now, and she sees his face before he reaches the exit. Stay seated, and maybe he buys himself a few more seconds behind the menu. But she was already into the dining area, already close enough that the math had collapsed. There were no good exits. There was only the table and the chair, and the fact that his legs had apparently decided to stay before his brain caught up. She stopped. One beat. He watched it happen the way her eyes found him, and then did something she didn't expect. Not recognition. Not yet. Just the small flicker of a person processing something that didn't immediately compute. Then it did, and her face didn't do what he had spent 7 months dreading. No sharp intake of breath. No manufactured smile. She just looked at him, and then, quietly, she smiled, not the polished version from the company announcements. Something older, something that looked like it had been waiting a long time to surface. She sat down. You actually showed up. He still hadn't spoken. She tilted her head, just slightly. How long were you planning to keep avoiding me, Nathan? His name, his real name, not the one on the maintenance badge, clipped to his chest. Every morning, before anyone else arrived. The sound of it landed somewhere behind his ribs in a place he hadn't prepared to defend. He had no answer. He had been rehearsing exits for 7 months. She had closed every one of them with 8 words. Nathan Cole woke at 4:50 in the morning. Not because an alarm told him to. His body had long since stopped needing one. Years of double shifts and broken sleep had recalibrated him at a cellular level. He woke at 4:50. He lay still for exactly 2 minutes. Then he got up. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on North Carver Street. The kind that smelled like radiator heat in winter. An old carpet year-round. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. A kitchen where the overhead light flickered if you turned it on too fast. He had learned to turn it on slowly. There was a leak under the bathroom sink the building manager had been meaning to fix for 4 months. The window in Lily's room stuck in summer and rattled in the cold. Nathan had learned the habits of every inconvenience in the place and worked around each one without complaint. He walked down the hall and looked in on Lily, 9 years old. She slept like she was falling, arms flung out, blankets twisted into shapes that defied physics, hair across her face. She had her mother's nose and his stubborn jaw, and she was the best thing he had ever done. Some mornings he stood in her doorway for a full minute, just to make sure she was real. He didn't examine that habit too closely. He just did it, and moved on. He made coffee. He packed her lunch peanut butter, apple slices, a folded note that said something sufficiently embarrassing like "Have a great Tuesday, kid." He left 20 minutes before she woke up, because Mrs. Petrov across the hall had a key and would walk her to the school bus. Mrs. Petrov was 71. And had lived in the building since before Nathan was born. She had 2 grown children in other states, a cat named Biscuit, and a habit of leaving small containers of homemade soup outside Nathan's door with a post-it that just said "Eat." He did not know what the first year would have looked like without her. He took the 5:20 train downtown. Hartwell Financial occupied floors 9 through 15 of a glass tower on Meridian Avenue. Nathan had worked building maintenance there for 2 years and 7 months. He knew every utility closet, every circuit panel, every HVAC filter on its rotating schedule. He cleaned the executive floors before the day began, carpet pristine, glass partitions streak-free, and was gone before the first assistant arrived at 7. He was invisible in the way men in gray uniforms are invisible in places built to impress. He preferred it that way. 7 months ago, the company hired a new CEO. The name moved through the building the way these things always do, in fragments, in break room conversations, in the particular charged air around a change at the top. To most of his colleagues, the name meant nothing. To Nathan, it meant he had stood very still in a utility closet for 40 seconds while the information settled into him. And then he had continued replacing a filter and said nothing to anyone. That evening, after Lily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and worked through the math of his options. He could leave. His record at Hartwell was clean, but Lily's school was 4 blocks away. Mrs. Petroff was across the hall. The commute on the 520 was 32 minutes, and he had read 3 books on it in the past year. He had built something small and functional here, and he did not want to dismantle it because of something that had happened in another version of his life. He stayed. He adjusted his schedule. He learned which elevator she used in the mornings and made sure he was never in it. He was careful the way a man is careful when the thing he is protecting is the only thing he has left that matters. And it had worked until tonight. He sat still. He did not stand, not because he was brave, he would not have called it that, but because the moment had passed before he could act on it. And now Victoria Marsh was sitting across from him, and the waiter was coming to ask about water, and there was nothing left to do except stay. The outdoor terrace was quiet around them. String lights overhead. The sound of other conversations at a careful remove. He was aware, sitting there, of something he hadn't fully let himself notice before, not across the distance of a hallway, not from the back, not in the fraction of a second before he turned away. She looked the same as the photographs on the 14th floor, and completely different at the same time. "You knew," he said finally. "That I worked there." "I suspected," she said. "I saw someone twice from a distance who moved like you. Both times the person turned before I could see his face. I wasn't certain." A pause. "I'm certain now." He said nothing. "My brother set this up," she said. "I don't think he knew anything about us." "He didn't." She looked at him across the table, not with the calculating patience of a CEO managing a difficult conversation, but with something closer to genuine curiosity, the kind that didn't need to perform itself. "Why are you working building maintenance, Nathan? No edge in it. That is a real question, not a judgment." "It's a job," he said. It was the shortest true answer he could give. The longer one, the one he had never said out loud to anyone, not to Marcus, who worked alongside him and assumed the early shift was simply a preference, not to Mrs. Petrov, who asked careful questions over Sunday tea and deserved better answers than she got, not to the hospital counselor he had seen 3 times after Claire died, before deciding that talking about it made it more real rather than less, and that he did not have the bandwidth for more real right now. That answer was different. It started with a number. 17 applications in the first 6 months after Avery Laund. Not one response, not one callback, not one email acknowledging receipt. And at a certain point, a man stops sending applications into silence and starts doing what needs to be done to keep the lights on and the school tuition current. Maintenance was honest work. The hours were fixed. Nobody called at midnight with a critical incident. He was home by 6. He could be there to make dinner and help with homework and hear about Colonel the Pigeon's latest dispute with the gray one near the dumpster. He had made a calculation. He stood by it. He did not say any of that. He had never said any of it to anyone. But Victoria didn't fill the silence with assumptions. She didn't lean forward with the sympathetic tilt people used when they were really just curious. She didn't offer him anything he hadn't asked for. She just waited, no pressure in it. No agenda visible. Just a woman who had decided that silence was a reasonable response to silence, and that he could take whatever time he needed. It was the first time in a long while that someone had waited for him like that. He looked at the tablecloth. Then, at her. Then, he began to talk. Because when a black man loses a job under a cloud, even an invented cloud, even one assembled by someone else, for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of his work, the phone stops ringing. A degree doesn't buy back a reputation someone else has burned. He had sent 17 applications in the first 6 months after Avery Laund. He had a clean engineering record. 7 years of documented results. References from firms that had trusted him with their most sensitive systems. Not one response. Not one callback. Not one email acknowledging receipt. And at a certain point, a man stops sending applications into silence and starts doing what needs to be done to keep the lights on, and the school tuition current, and his daughter fed. He had sat in that silence long enough to understand what it meant. Not bad luck, not poor timing. He had watched colleagues with thinner records get called back within days after similar setbacks. He had watched the pattern play out over months until it was undeniable. There were rooms he used to walk into where people shook his hand and asked for his opinion, and then there were rooms where he pushed a cart and nobody made eye contact. The industry had a particular way of closing around a damaged name, and the closing was faster, he had come to understand, depending on what you looked like when you walked through the door. He did not carry this as bitterness. He had decided early that bitterness was a weight he could not afford to carry, and also raise a child, and also grieve a wife, and so he had set it down somewhere in the first year and not gone back for it. What he carried instead was precision. He knew what things cost. He knew what things were worth. He knew the difference between a system that had failed him and a life that was still, despite everything, worth building carefully. Maintenance was honest work. The hours were fixed. Nobody called at midnight with a critical incident. He was home by 6. He could be there to make dinner and help with homework and hear about Colonel the Pigeon's latest territorial dispute with the gray one near the dumpster. He had made a calculation. He stood by it, but Victoria wasn't the building or the system or the room where nobody looked at him. She was a woman at a candlelit table who had asked a direct question and then sat completely still and waited for a direct answer without filling the space with her own conclusions. That was rarer than she probably knew. He looked at her across the table and felt the particular weight of 3 years of unsaid things press against the inside of his chest. He did not say any of it. He had never said any of it to anyone, but she didn't fill the silence with assumptions. She didn't lean forward with the sympathetic tilt people used when they were really just curious. She didn't offer him anything he hadn't asked for. She just waited, no pressure in it. No agenda visible. Just a woman who had decided that silence was a reasonable response to silence, and that he could take whatever time he needed. He said, "It's a longer story than that," she said. "We ordered dessert. We have time." So he told her. 3 years ago, he had been brought in on a consulting contract. Avery Lawn Capital, a mid-sized investment firm on the north side of the city, suspected breach, needed someone external to keep the assessment out of hands that might have an interest in shaping it. He had found the intrusion on the 3rd day. It was deeper than anyone had mapped. It had been sitting in the system for 11 months, reading but not writing, patient in the way the worst threats are patient. If it had triggered, the client data exposure would have been significant enough to attract federal attention. He had found it. He had isolated it. He had written the full report. He had also found something else. A secondary flaw in a legacy authentication module 1 the infrastructure team had flagged 18 months earlier and been told to defer. The deferred patch was documented. The risk assessment left no room for interpretation. The decision to delay had come from the top of the infrastructure division. He had reported both findings because that was his job, and he did his job completely and without exception. What happened next was not part of his job description. The lead infrastructure director, a man named Grayson, decided that the most efficient resolution was to let Nathan absorb responsibility for both issues. The story that reached the board was clean and simple. The contractor had overlooked a critical vulnerability. The contractor had been released. The matter was resolved. The client didn't have to hear about their own team's negligence. The board didn't have to discipline anyone internal. And the black consultant on a temporary contract had no institutional standing to contest any of it effectively. Victoria had gone very still. "I had the documentation," Nathan said. "The supplementary notes, the original reports, the timestamps. I could have fought it. I had a paper trail that told a different story than the one Grayson constructed." He paused, but Claire had been in the hospital for 2 months. Lily was 6 years old. I was sleeping 4 hours a night on a pull-out chair and making sure I was home every morning so she had at least one consistent thing in her life. A legal dispute that I might not win anyway. The energy simply wasn't there. He looked at his water glass, set it down. I signed the agreement. took what they offered, and walked away. Something shifted in Victoria's expression. Not pity, he would have closed the conversation immediately if it had been pity. Something more careful than that, the particular attention of someone trying to understand a thing correctly, not just to have understood it and moved on. "I know that firm," she said quietly. "I was on the risk committee at Avery Lawn at that time. The consultants were anonymous to the committee. We only received summary reports. I didn't know it was you." He looked at her. "I didn't know it was you either. On the committee." "I didn't know," she said again, simply, as a fact that didn't require anything from him in return. He sat with that for a moment, the strange geometry of it, that she had been in the adjacent room, the one that received the cleaned and shaped version of events and had not known the person behind the redacted name. Not comforting exactly, just clarifying in a way he hadn't expected. Victoria did not say she was sorry about Claire. He was grateful for that. Sorry was a word that had been said to him so many times in the months after Claire died, that it had lost all its weight, a sound people made, when they didn't know what else to offer, when the silence felt too heavy, and they needed something to put in it. She didn't offer it. Instead, she said, Claire passed 8 months after the breach. Not a question. She had done the math herself. Yes, she nodded once, said nothing, and somehow that was exactly right. Nathan looked at the candle at the center of the table. He hadn't talked about any of this, not the Avery Lawn situation, not Grayson, not the 17 applications, not the particular quality of silence in the apartment in those first months after Claire was gone, when he checked on Lily 3 or 4 times a night, not because she was in danger, but because the quiet was hostile, and checking was the only thing that felt purposeful in 3 years. He had packed it into a box labeled things that happened in another life, and had not opened it. He had been too busy building the current one, which was smaller and less impressive but present and real and his. "I don't regret it," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Claire needed me home. Lily needed me home. Everything else was secondary. I made a calculation in a hard moment, and I would make it again. That's not weakness," Victoria said. "I know some people see it that way. Some people have the luxury of not having a 9-year-old and a dying wife to go home to." Her voice was even, not harsh, just accurate. "That's triage, not a failing." He looked at her for a long moment. His phone rang at 8:47. He glanced at the screen, and something in him that had been held carefully rigid all evening released without warning. His posture changed. His face changed. He was reaching for the phone before he had consciously decided to. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's my daughter. Take it," Victoria said immediately. He stepped away from the table. She could see him at the edge of the terrace, could not hear the words, only the register of his voice. Lower now, warmer, the clipped precision that characterized everything he said, replaced by something looser and easier, something that fit him differently. She heard him laugh once, brief and unguarded. It was the most undefended thing she had seen from him all evening. He came back 2 minutes later. "She wanted to know if I'd ordered dessert yet. Have you?" "Haven't decided." He sat down. "She also wanted to know if the person I was having dinner with was nice or just fancy." Victoria looked at him. "What did you tell her?" He considered it with more seriousness than she expected. "I said I was still figuring that out." "That seems accurate," she said. He almost smiled. They ordered dessert. They ate it slowly. The conversation moved to easier terrain, his daughter's current obsession with mallard migration, her ongoing documentation of a pigeon near their building named Colonel, whom she considered probably smarter than most adults, and certainly more consistent. Victoria found herself less interested in managing the conversation than in simply having it, which was unusual enough that she noticed and filed away. Victoria did not sleep well that night. That was not unusual. She had not been a reliable sleeper since her early 30s, when she had learned that her brain reserved its most inconvenient thinking for the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning. She had developed strategies. A book, a specific herbal tea, a notepad on the nightstand for writing down whatever was circling so it could stop circling. She wrote Nathan Cole on the notepad. Then Grayson. Then Avery Lawn. Full incident record. She put the pad down. She told herself it could wait until morning. It waited until 6:15, which was roughly when morning began in her estimation. She had the file pulled from archives before her assistant arrived at 7. She read it carefully, not for the first time, but this time with context she hadn't previously had. The contractor's name was redacted throughout. The board's decision was recorded as unanimous. The internal memo from Grayson was precisely worded, in the way memos are precisely worded when someone has spent considerable time thinking about what to leave out and how to characterize what remains. She read the original infrastructure team report, dated 18 months before the incident. The deferred patch flag was explicit. The risk assessment left no room for interpretation. The authorization to defer had come from Grayson himself. She sat with that for a while. Then she called Patricia Haynes, head of her legal team, a careful woman who had been with Hartwell for 11 years and had a reputation for being exactly as thorough as a situation required, and not 1 degree more. "I need to review an old incident record with you," Victoria said. "There may be a question of misattributed professional responsibility." "How old?" 3 years. "The contractor's documentation was filed but not attached to the primary record. I want to understand why, and what the record should actually reflect." Patricia said she would look at it. 3 weeks after the blind date, Nathan ran into Victoria in the hallway on the 14th floor. Not by design. He had been replacing a corridor fixture at 5:40 in the morning, working from a stepladder with the building still mostly dark and quiet around him. When he heard the elevator open at the end of the hall, he looked over. She was earlier than usual. She had not expected to see anyone. Neither of them executed the smooth course correction that his 7 months of avoidance had trained him for. They looked at each other across the length of the corridor in the quiet before the building day started. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. She walked to her office. He finished the fixture. He stood at the top of the ladder for a moment after she had gone, aware that something had shifted in the space between them in a way he couldn't quite locate or name. And then he climbed down, packed his tools, and went to start on the floor below. He texted her that evening. He was not entirely sure why. He told himself it was because a light had been left on after hours, and maintenance was supposed to log that kind of thing. That wasn't true. And he knew it wasn't true, and he texted her anyway. "How's the restructuring going?" She responded 40 minutes later. "Slower than I'd like. Better than it was." Then, "How's the Colonel?" He stared at his phone. He went to the window, where Lily had posted her most recent field notes on Colonel's territorial activity on a sticky note attached to the glass. "Lily says he found a girlfriend. Good for him. She wants to know if you've ever seen a pigeon do a courtship display. I have not. She says it's the most ridiculous thing she's ever witnessed, and she respects it deeply." A pause. Then, "That is the most accurate description of professional networking I have ever heard." He laughed. Quietly, in the kitchen, with his daughter asleep down the hall. It was a small laugh, the kind that surprises you by arriving before you expected it. He had not been surprised by a laugh in a long time. Patricia's report came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered in Patricia's characteristic style, without softening, without preamble, without any of the diplomatic cushioning that most people considered a professional courtesy when delivering findings that implicated someone senior. "The record is inaccurate," she said. "The contractor's supplementary notes, filed contemporaneously, but not attached to the primary incident record, explicitly state that the secondary vulnerability predated his engagement by over a year and fell outside the defined scope of his assessment. The board memo that shaped the final incident report omits these notes entirely. Based on document metadata and timestamp analysis, the omission does not appear to be accidental," Victoria said. "What are our options? We can amend the public record to reflect accurate findings and issue a formal statement acknowledging the correct attribution of the secondary failure. If the contractor chooses to pursue any professional recourse on the basis of the corrected record, the amendment would be supportive of his position." A pause. "Grayson retired 2 years ago. He's no longer with the company." "I know. I'm informing you because it affects the scope of internal consequence. There's no one currently employed who faces disciplinary exposure from this correction. The matter is purely a question of record accuracy at this point." "Amend the record," Victoria said. "Prepare the statement. I'll review the draft tonight and return comments by morning." After Patricia hung up, Victoria sat for a moment at her desk in the empty office, with the city lights coming through the window at the particular flat angle they took on in the late afternoon. She had corrected records before, reversed attributions, untangled the careful misdirections that organizations sometimes built around their own failures. She had always done it because it was the accurate thing to do. That had not changed, but she was aware, sitting there, that this particular correction had a weight to it that the others hadn't had. She put that awareness in one part of her mind and the professional task in another and went back to work. She called Nathan that evening. He was quiet. For a long time after she finished speaking, she could hear Lily in the background, a nature documentary. Something with ocean sounds and a narrator describing deep water creatures with considerable enthusiasm. When Nathan finally spoke, his voice was very careful. The way his voice got, when he was holding something steady, by deliberate effort. "You didn't have to do that. The record was wrong," she said. "It needed to be corrected. That's a documentation problem." "I'm the CEO. Correcting documentation problems is part of the job." Silence on the line. "You're not going to say thank you, are you?" she said. "I'm thinking. Take your time." He took 3 full seconds. For Nathan Cole, that was roughly the equivalent of a lengthy speech. "Thank you. Don't. I didn't do it for gratitude." "I know," he said. "That's why it means something." She didn't have an answer for that. It was the first moment in all their conversations that she found herself without one. She sat for a moment after they hung up with the phone still in her hand, looking at nothing in particular. Then she set it down and went back to the draft statement Patricia had sent and read it through a second time very carefully. It was accurate, understated, exactly right. She approved it as written without a single change. The statement was released on a Monday, folded into a broader compliance communication that the financial press would find too procedural to cover. It was seen by the people who needed to see it. Nathan received 2 phone calls the following week. One from a former colleague who had known him during the Avery Lawn contract, one from a mid-sized security firm he had worked with briefly before everything had come apart. Both calls were friendly and carefully tentative, the kind that opened doors without forcing them. He hadn't called either of them back yet. He told Victoria about both calls on a Saturday afternoon, on the river path near his apartment. Lily was 10 feet ahead of them, crouched over the railing with her phone, photographing a duck with the focused intensity of someone who understood that lighting and angle were everything and would not be rushed by anyone. "What are you going to do?" Victoria asked. "I don't know yet." She nodded and didn't push. She had a tolerance for unresolved questions that most people didn't possess. She could sit with an open answer without needing to close it before it was ready. Lily straightened up and turned around. "Dad, can I ask her something about food?" "Lily, I'm asking you first. That's being polite." Nathan looked at Victoria. "She wants to know if you like Thai food. She has been asking me to find out for 2 weeks. She wants to invite you to dinner. She says she'll make dumplings." He paused. "Which means I will make dumplings, and she will direct the entire operation with considerable authority." Victoria was quiet for a moment, not the precise, calculated quiet she used in board meetings. Something softer. The kind that meant something was getting through a layer she usually kept closed. "Tell her yes," she said. Dinner was on a Thursday. Lily had approached the occasion with the focused energy she applied to all important projects. She had opinions about the dumpling-to-soup ratio. She had a timeline. She had assigned herself the role of quality assurance and performed it by tasting 1 dumpling every 8 minutes and delivering her findings with the gravity of a senior editor reviewing final proofs before publication. Victoria arrived at 6:45 with a bottle of sparkling water and a book about deep-sea creatures she had found at a used bookstore on Elm Street, slightly worn, annotated in the margins in someone else's careful handwriting, the kind of book that had already been loved before it arrived at its next reader. Lily opened the door before Nathan reached it. She studied Victoria for exactly 2 seconds. "You're prettier than I thought," she said. Nathan made a pained sound from somewhere behind her. Victoria crouched down to Lily's level without hesitation. "Thank you. You're taller than I expected. I'm in the 92nd percentile for my age." "That's impressive. Dad says it's genetic." A brief pause. "Do you want to see my duck photos?" "Very much," Victoria said. Nathan stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his daughter lead Victoria to the couch, with the brisk efficiency of a curator, escorting someone through a private collection. Victoria sat and looked at every single photograph with genuine interest, not polite attention, but the same focused quality she brought to quarterly reports. She asked about focal length. She asked whether the duck had a regular schedule. She asked if Lily had a name for him. Gerald, Lily said. But Colonel is the pigeon. They're entirely different animals. Of course, Victoria said. Apologies. Lily accepted this with the graciousness of someone who understood that not everyone had the necessary background knowledge going in. Nathan turned back to the dumplings. He folded them the way Claire had taught him, the edge pinched into small, even pleats, each one closed tight enough to hold through steaming. Lily had been working on the same technique for over a year and was almost there. Behind him, he could hear his daughter explaining the difference between mallard behavior during migration and during nesting season, her voice animated and unhurried in the particular way it got when she had an audience that was genuinely listening. He realized he was smiling at the steamer pot. He didn't try to stop it. He called both numbers back the following week. The first conversation was brief. The project wasn't a fit, he said so directly. They parted on good terms. The second was more complicated. The firm was smaller than where he had worked before, infrastructure security for mid-market companies, rather than the large institutional clients he had built his career around. The work was concrete and technically demanding. The hours were realistic. They said home by 6, and they said it like they had thought carefully about what that phrase meant and decided it mattered. He told them he would think about it. He talked to Victoria about it that weekend. "I'm not coming back to Hartwell," he said, before she had a chance to speak. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever is or isn't happening between us, that's a line I'm not crossing. I wasn't going to suggest it. I know. I'm saying it for myself. So it's in the record." She almost smiled at that. She understood the impulse, exactly the need to put things clearly into the documentation. No ambiguity, no room for later misinterpretation. It was the same instinct she operated from professionally, just applied to a different kind of record. "The smaller firm," he said. "It's the kind of work I was actually good at. Real problems, real systems. And I'd be home by 6. That matters," she said. "It matters most," he said. "After everything, that still matters most." She didn't try to rearrange his priorities. She had spent too many years in rooms where people ranked ambition above everything else and called it wisdom, as though wanting to be home for dinner was a character flaw rather than a reasonable human preference. She had never entirely believed it. She wasn't going to start now. He took the job. He gave his notice at Hartwell on a Tuesday. His supervisor, Dennis, a quiet man, who had treated him decently and without unnecessary curiosity about who he was outside of work hours, shook his hand and said it had been a genuine pleasure having him on the team. Nathan thanked him and meant it fully. Dennis wasn't responsible for any of the larger architecture of Nathan's life. He had just been a decent man in a gray uniform, the same as Nathan, and that was worth acknowledging before walking out the door for the last time. His last day, he cleaned floors 13 and 14 one final time, methodical, early, leaving everything clean and correct, carpet pristine, glass partitions streak-free, every surface in the condition it should have been before the workday started. He was at the elevator bank at 5:48 in the morning, cart packed, ready to leave. He heard his name. Victoria was standing at the end of the executive corridor, holding 2 cups of coffee. She had come in before her usual time, before anyone else. She crossed the hallway and handed him one without ceremony. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." They stood in the half-light of the empty corridor and drank their coffee. The building was quiet around them. In an hour, it would fill with all the ordinary noise of an organization going about its business. And no one who walked through this hallway would know that anything had happened here. That was fine. Not everything needed an audience. The dumplings became a Thursday thing. Not every week. Sometimes Victoria had a late call. Sometimes Nathan had an early site visit at the new job. Sometimes Lily came home from soccer practice too tired to do anything but eat crackers on the couch and watch marine biology documentaries with a blanket pulled to her chin. But often enough. Enough that Lily stopped asking whether Victoria was coming and started asking what time she was arriving. It was a Thursday in late autumn, when Lily looked up from the dinner table, with the directness that 9-year-olds deploy without warning or apology. "Are you two going to get married?" The kitchen went completely quiet. Nathan set down his chopsticks. Victoria looked at the child with an expression that belonged to no identifiable category. Lily looked between them, unbothered. "I'm just asking. For planning purposes, it changes how I explain things to people at school. The information is different depending on the answer." Nathan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Nathan. "Girlfriend," Nathan said. For now, Lily considered this with the gravity of someone evaluating evidence before filing it in the correct place. She nodded once, satisfied, and returned to her dumplings. "Okay, but don't take too long. Colonel is already on his second egg." Victoria pressed her lips together very carefully. Nathan looked at the ceiling. Then they both laughed. The kind that comes without warning. The kind that is finished before you fully realize you've started. The kind that surprises you into it. Later, after Lily had gone to bed and the kitchen was clean, and the leftover dumplings were wrapped in the refrigerator, they sat on the small couch with their feet on the coffee table and the city making its quiet evening sounds outside. On the windowsill, Lily had left a drawing. Colonel in profile, rendered in gray crayon with a single orange beak, and beneath it, in her careful printed letters, "My pigeon, not actually mine." And below that, in slightly smaller letters, "Dad's girlfriend likes him too." Nathan had found it there 2 days ago. He hadn't moved it. He wasn't going to move it. There was a version of his life he thought about sometimes, the one where Avery Lond had ended differently, where he had stayed and fought and produced the documentation, and one where his professional record had remained intact and the career had continued in the direction it had been heading. He thought about that version the way you think about a road you didn't take. Without grief, without particular regret, just the quiet awareness that the other road existed somewhere and that he was not on it, and that this was not a loss. He had a daughter who named pigeons and photographed ducks and was in the 92nd percentile for her age, and had opinions about mallard migration that she was willing to defend at considerable length to anyone who sat still long enough. He had an apartment where the kitchen light flickered if you turned it on too fast, and he had learned to turn it on slowly. He had a woman sitting beside him on a small couch who had corrected a 3-year-old lie in a corporate record because it was the accurate thing to do, not for him specifically, not for any reward, not because anyone was watching or expecting it, but because inaccurate records needed to be made accurate, and she was the person in a position to do it. That was the whole reason. That was enough. He had traded one version of a life for this one without knowing what the trade would eventually yield, or what shape the return would take, or whether any return was coming at all. He was keeping it, entirely, without reservation.